All right, welcome to our flipped video on the antebellum time period. This is going to cover the Antebellum Unit. With us today, we have Mr. Dennis, we have Eduardo, Kenneth, Zadok, Joseph, Jasmine, and Mr. Russo. We're going to go through the Antebellum Unit using these Cornell notes, or if you just have blank Cornell notes, you can use those as well. And you just need to follow along, and when we write something down, you'll write it too. So let's get right into it. The very first thing on here that I want to remind everybody is for our hook activity we talked about, was there ever a time in your life where you were trying to work out or prevent yourself from experiencing like violence and it didn't work out? So was there basically ever a time in your life where you were in somebody was trying to like fight you and you were trying to avoid it, but you had no choice but to use violence? That was the hook activity, and that was the kind of question you can think about now. And the reason why we did that as our hook activity is so that you could kind of connect what was going on back during the antebellum period with your own life. During the antebellum period, we were going to see the United States tries to use diplomacy, but ultimately it breaks down and fails. So that's why we did that for your hook. Now, the reason why you need to study this, why it's so important, why you have to be in here and go do this video and learn this unit, is because Mr. Dennis take over.
Why I always tell my kids that it's important because it's the beginning of our nation as we see it today. Prior to the Civil War, I always tell kids being from Virginia was more important than being American. After the Civil War, there was more of a national pride that was embedded in our mindset or our psychology from there forward. So it was the beginning of what we see as America today.
Right. And another big piece is this idea that the United States government worked as best it could with the problems it had to work things out peacefully. And you're going to see that a lot in this, but ultimately you're going to see that it starts to break down and fail. So that's kind of why it's so important, why we have to say it. Now, two very important terms that we're going to go through, just as a heads up, is the term antebellum itself. The definition of this is basically the period before Civil War.
That's it. Time before Civil War.
What do you think? What would you say the dates are? So Civil War is 1861, right? So what was it, like 1820? Like after
probably,
the war, 1812?
Yeah, Nat Turner, 1830s, right around there. Yeah.
So it's like what, the 30, 40-year period before the Civil War?
Exactly.
So we could put that, unless you didn't already know it. So period before Civil War from roughly 1830-ish to 1861. Sectionalism, it's another word that's going to come up pretty soon here. I kind of define it just by using the word itself, like it's your section. In this case, there were three main sections of the United States, and we might as well jump to that next slide right now, which were, this graphic kind of sums it up the best. There really were like three main sections of the country during this time period. You got your north right here, which is purple, the south, which is gray, and the west right here. So sectionalism was, and it wasn't just like the section of the country, is that people from that section were really kind of what they did and what they valued was way different than the other section.
Cultural differences, yeah. And then the big issue coming up that you guys will find is all this unsettled Western territory. What do we do with it? Does it follow the culture of the South or does it follow the culture of the North? Right. So keep that in mind.
So you could say sectionalism is where the country was kind of divided into different sections.
Yeah, pretty easy.
All right.
Might want to put in parentheses like the word culture too. Because the ways of life were different from people living in the North versus people living in the South.
Cultures. They start to merge in the West.
Yeah.
All right. So far, so good. Are there any questions? All on the same page? All right, here we go. So, what caused the fight? Think about like some of the conflicts or fights you see, I don't know, at high school, like rumors or what else causes fights? People are mean mugging each other in the hallway. Like, what are you looking at?
We're trying to get other people.
Yeah. These are some of the things.
And boyfriends.
Yes.
Yeah.
These are all causes of conflict at Westy, right? Money.
Sometimes people owe people money.
Right. So for this time period, there are really two main things we're going to see, and that should be our next slide. Two main issues that lead to the conflict. The first one is kind of like Mr. Deno was saying earlier, this difference between a national government versus state government. And state government really was the focus. So That's an issue, and the other one has to do, it's kind of like two. It's this idea of, Mr. Dennis and I were talking about this earlier, if the United States would have never grown west during westward expansion, chances are maybe never would have had a civil war. The fact that the United States starts growing, and you have this question is, are those new territories or states going to be slave or free? That's where you start to get some of the conflict.
Yeah, westward expansion was probably the biggest cause in the divide there.
Right. So those are our two main causes. Now, a quote that's, I don't think I have it in here, but that we'll get to in a little bit is a famous Jefferson quote. It says, "We have the wolf by the ears. We can neither hold him nor safely let him go." Now, obviously, this wasn't like a literal Thomas Jefferson had a pet wolf in his backyard, right? This is a metaphor that is talking about slavery, and I know you really like that.
Absolutely. No, like Zadok, you're a wrestler, right? If you have somebody pinned, if you got him down, how long can you hold him down there for?
Just until it decides to let go.
Until you either let go, your energy goes out, or he reverses it and gets on. That's what Jefferson was saying about the slavery. Slavery was the wolf. We're holding it, we have it in check now, but at some point our arms are going to tire out, or that wolf's going to escape and it's going to turn around and bite us at some point. So once we start, especially with westward expansion, it was inevitable that there was going to be a conflict and that wolf was going to snap back at some point.
Yeah, and Jefferson, he's right there, right? Declaration of Independence. He's the one that says this, and he kind of, I don't know, it seems like it embodied this, being that he talked about independence and freedom, yet at the same time he owned slaves himself.
Kind of a contradiction.
A little bit of a contradiction. Yeah. So, if you look down where it says sectionalism, we're going to just look at that. We already talked a little bit about it, so we'll kind of cruise through this. But just so you know the differences between the three, and when we get into culture, the north right here, and you'll notice in your notes it says, was focused on manufacturing. Manufacturing really was things getting made, stuff that gets built, whether it's like a train or steel or architecture, buildings. This is where stuff in the United States got built. Yeah. Some of the machines that come around with the Industrial Revolution. So in the north, you have people that make stuff and sell it for a living, so that kind of shapes their culture. The south was totally focused on agriculture. Not just any kind of agriculture, especially cotton. So in the South, farming was huge. I've got this trusty book right here that has a pretty helpful picture that shows what the invention of the cotton gin does. So Eli Whitney, right around the 1800s, basically has this invention called the cotton gin, which cotton gin picks seeds out of cotton. The reason why this is so huge is before the cotton gin gets built, it was really expensive to have a cotton farm. You could have one, but you probably didn't make a whole lot of money off of it, because it would take like 8 guys to do the job of what one guy could do with the cotton gin. So when he invents this, if you look at this graph from the year 1800 all the way to 1860, it starts off in yellow right here, right? And then you can see that it just kind of explodes out each chunk of like 40 years. So you have just in 1800 the yellow here, and then it goes to the next color, this green color, where it spreads even more, so on and so forth. You get the idea that cotton farming basically like greatly increases. So when we talk about here, the South using farming and having an agrarian economy, this is a big part of it. And although you didn't need as many slaves, you still needed a lot of slaves to do a lot of this labor, like getting the cotton and bringing it in.
And that's exactly why the cotton gin gets a lot of blame for prolonging slavery, because look at all the cotton production that comes after the invention of the machine. It doesn't replace slavery, it increases the need of slavery because now we're producing more. Production goes up, so you still need those slaves.
Sure. Okay, so the West, and that's another side note, the Atlantic slave trade, I know there's some confusion about this. You know how in the earlier units we talked about the triangular trade, how there were Africans that were brought over? This technically officially ends in 1807 in the United States. They make it a law that says no new slaves can come to the United States. So when we talk about slaves, we're talking about from 1807 on, just the slaves are in the United States. It's not like new slaves are coming from Africa. That makes sense? All right. The West. The economy, a lot of it was based on just exploring some of the gold that was found in California. Cattle, maybe hunting. I don't know. Can you think of?
Yeah, no, that's a trailblazing. Yeah, opportunity.
All right, so next up, our next slide takes us to the first conflict of the antebellum period, which becomes known as the Missouri Compromise. So, take a look either at your notes or at this graphic map. Here's what happens. These green states are basically your free states within the United States. So if you lived in Pennsylvania, New York, Vermont, or Indiana, slavery was like, you weren't allowed to do it, right? It was pretty, I don't know, was it illegal or just frowned upon? I'm trying to remember.
Frowned upon.
Yeah, pretty frowned upon. Like it wasn't really accepted.
Yeah.
Whereas in the South, you were absolutely able. Not only was it accepted, but it was the norm. It wasn't like any way against the law. So what happens when we know? Well, if you think back to Thomas Jefferson, we know he gets the Louisiana Purchase from France, right? He secures a huge chunk of land all the way from Louisiana up through here. And this is what we talked about at the beginning. This is this whole idea of westward expansion and the conflict over slavery. So here's what goes down. The Southerners in the Senate basically say, hey, there's a new place that wants to become a state. It's Missouri. And they want Missouri to come in as a slave state. The Northerners say, no way, Jose. We want Missouri to be a non-slave state. So you see how that's a little bit of an argument? And they start to get into a conflict in the Senate where they decide these kind of things, right? Here's what happens next. Do you see this guy? All these pictures of these guys I'm going to show, they look like Skeletor, like the craziest. Like, have you ever seen anybody in your life that, like...
Would you take candy from that guy?
It's almost like you look like
you shouldn't take candy from anybody, but especially not that guy. He's a creepy looking dude.
He's a pretty creepy looking guy, right? But he ends up, right here, he ends up serving a pretty huge role. His name is Henry Clay. Everybody remember that? And he gets, by the end of all this, he gets the name as the Great Compromiser. He's kind of like when you see two people about to fight and they're going toe to toe and they're like, oh dang, they're about to fight. And then you see somebody step and be like, hey guys, we can work this out. That's kind of like what Henry Clay is. So what does he do? What does that look like? Well, he steps in and he has an idea. He says, okay, you guys, no need to get crazy here. No need to fight. Here's my idea. We'll let Missouri come in as a slave state. And all the Northerners are like, no, no, no. He's like, well, hold on. Wait, this is what we're going to do. We will have this state up here, Maine, which formerly was actually Massachusetts. We'll switch it to its own state, Maine, and we'll make it free. And the reason why this is so important is because if Missouri would have come in as slave, then they would have had 2 senators that would have been from the South. And at this point, they had an equal number of free and slave states in the Senate. So if you have an equal number of senators, it means equal power. Missouri would have gotten 2 more guys, then the South would have had more power. So Clay letting Maine come in brings it to a balance.
Balance.
Yeah, is that what you're saying?
That's it.
An evil balance.
Equal.
Equal balance. Yes, equal. Exactly, equal, right? So Maine comes in as free. Missouri comes in as slave. Now the other thing he says is he says, okay, the Northerners still are pretty upset because they say, hey, wait a minute, you're really getting into our territory up here. Do you see how these are all kind of down here, but Missouri's like, boom, getting into the free area? So this is what he says. He says, all right, I tell you what, to balance this out, we're going to take this line, the 36th line of latitude, and any state from now on that comes in this area above it will automatically be free, and any state like Arkansas and I guess eventually Louisiana that comes in below it will be slave. So if you're a northern, you're just like, hey, wait a minute. So you're trying to tell me that they only get that much because it stops here? Because remember, this it's like Spain / what eventually becomes Mexico. If you're a northerner, you're like, oh yeah, look at all this land.
Yeah.
All right, Clay. And the southerners are just like, we agree. Each side has to give up a little, but they come to a compromise or balance, right? Crisis averted because things were getting kind of heated. So everybody's just like, okay. So it's like if you're able to break the fight and be like, hey, they weren't mean muggy, they're just having a bad day. And the guy's just like, in the hallway's like, oh, okay, we're cool. And then they go their separate ways. That's kind of what happens. Things start getting tense and then they get worked out. Does that make sense? So, who in their own words wants to say what was the Missouri Compromise? What do you think? This is your chance.
Broke up the fight between North and South.
Yeah, there was a fight. What was it over? The state of
Missouri.
Missouri. Yeah.
Yeah, that was it.
And what did the Southerners want? They wanted it to be.
They wanted it to be a slave state.
And what did the Northerners want?
They wanted it to be a free state.
And how did they work it out?
Henry
Clay, right?
Clay said that at that line they'll break it up and just have the free states be above the line and the slave states be below it.
Right. And to keep the number balanced in the Senate, because Missouri gets 2 for the slave, what state
give
comes
Maine.
in? Maine comes in 2, right? Okay.
Nicely done.
All right. So that was the first tense thing, and then things kind of mellow out. So let's turn the page. That happens in 1820. 12 years go by, and things start getting tense again. So this time,
What was wrong with this guy?
John C. Calhoun. I don't know who's scarier looking, Henry Clay or Calhoun. At least Calhoun has the hair. Look at that hair. Look at that hair.
Either way, don't take candy from him.
I love candy though.
So
Not
if
from
you
that
guys,
anymore.
if you've ever held a $20 bill in your hand, the
Right.
president on it is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson is kind of a controversial president. A lot of people think he did great things for the country. He has kind of a spotty record, to say the least, with what happens to Native Americans. He was a big push behind what happened with Native Americans in the Native Removal Act of 1830.
Trail of Tears.
Sound familiar, Western expansion people? Westward.
Elsewhere.
So he also, do you see on his, you can kind of see in this picture, he has a crazy scar on his face. I guess during the Revolutionary War, there was a British soldier that like told him to kiss his boot or shine his boot or something, where he was like trying to humiliate him, and he refused it. So the British soldier like stood up and slashed his face to like teach him a lesson. He had this huge gash. Crazy.
Oh, poor guy.
He also gets in a duel before he was president or after, I can't remember.
Before.
I think it was before,
Yeah.
where he gets in a duel with a guy, gets shot in the chest. You get like one bullet, each guy got one bullet, right? He gets shot in the chest, the other guy thinks he won, and then he like steadies himself, takes aim, and shoots and kills the other guy. And the bullet like goes right next to his heart. And he doesn't die, isn't that crazy?
It's crazy.
What did he shoot the other guy?
What's that?
That's true.
What did he shoot
I
the
think he shot him in the chest,
Yeah.
but it like went through his lung or went through his heart and killed him. That was like the president, right? Isn't that crazy? Our president, one of our presidents, the 7th president, got in a duel and killed someone.
You think
After getting
Obama's cool
shot.
because he listens to Jay-Z?
That's like
He
a
does,
whole new
exactly.
level. Yes. All right, so here's what happens. Andrew Jackson is the current president of the United States in the year 1832, right? He is the president right here in Washington, D.C. Scary, don't take candy from this guy, John C. Calhoun, was the senator from a state called South Carolina. John C. Calhoun is the senator from California, and here's where the conflict comes in. And this is more the states' rights versus the national rights for this conflict. So basically what happens is Andrew Jackson passed what's called a tariff. And let's write down, you should have a spot where it says tariff. Let's write down what a tariff is. A tariff is when you have a tax on goods coming into your country. So a tax on goods coming into your,
Or imports for you
Country.
fancy linguists.
or better known as an import, a tax on import. So I'm going to play out a pretty basic math scenario and see if it makes sense. So on this map right here, let's just picture, say England is over here. And I'm going to draw it here, and then maybe I can show the camera when we get done. So pretend there's a shoe that gets sold for $2 in Europe, or in England, right? And there's an American guy selling a shoe for $2.50. Now it makes sense. If I'm a New Yorker walking down the street and I see a shoe that was made in America that cost $2.50, and I see an English shoe that costs just $2, which shoe will I buy?
English.
The English shoe, because it's cheaper, unless I really like European shoes. Then
Unless
maybe
you're
I'll-
American.
Some American.
You only buy American.
It's Merc.
It's American.
Speak American, I'll buy American.
So if that's the case, then most people are going to buy the English shoe. And the American business guy that sells shoes
Doesn't like that.
doesn't like that because he doesn't make very much money. So here's what Andrew Jackson does. He says, hey, working with Congress, he said, why don't we make a tariff or a rule,
A tax, if you will.
a tax on goods coming in. Let's say we charge $1 per shoe. So they pass this tax or tariff, and now if that shoe that comes from England costs $2 and there's a $1 tariff, that shoe now costs $3. So same scenario. I'm walking down the street, I see an American shoe that costs $2.50 and a shoe from England that costs $3 because of the tariff. Which shoe do I buy now?
English. I'm not the English. American.
The American, because it's cheaper now because of that tariff, right? So I buy that shoe. Who likes this? The American business guy in the north. So picture this. Andrew Jackson does this. He passes this tariff, right? When he passes this tariff, he comes out kind of looking like a hero, right?
Yeah.
Where does that dollar go of the tariff? It goes right into the American, basically to Jackson, to the U.S. government. So the U.S. government's getting more money, and the business guys get more business in America. So Andrew Jackson in the North comes out coming across as a great president. Does that make sense?
It's money.
So what does crazy-looking Calhoun have a problem? What's his beef? Why does this become a problem? Here's why. Let's say that 3 British boats or English boats come every month to sell these shoes, right? So there's 3 British boats that come from England. They go to the port of New York, and they drop off all these shoes. Well, not as many people are buying these British shoes or English shoes anymore. Now, I forgot an important piece of information. So, 3 boats come from England, and they're packed with, Kenneth, what? What's inside the boats? Shoes, right? So you've got 3 boats full of shoes. Nice work, Kenneth. They get here to New York City, but I forgot an important detail. When they unload all those shoes, they sail down to the southern coast, and they load up on lots of cotton, because cotton is in huge demand in England because they use it to help make shoes, help make clothes. So those 3 boats drop off their shoes. We'll say this is before the tariff gets passed. They drop off their shoes in New York City, sail down to South Carolina, and fill their boats up with lots of cotton, which makes Calhoun and all the Southerners in the South really happy because they're making a lot of money selling cotton, right? Here's what happens next. Tariff gets passed. Instead of 3 British boats carrying shoes, now let's say it goes down to only 1 boat.
Why would it only go down to 1?
Because if people, great question, Mr. Dennis. Because if people were buying American or English shoes, and now people start buying the American shoes because of the tariff, not as many people are buying English shoes. If not as many people are buying English shoes, they're not going to send as many boats over. Does that make sense? So instead of 3 boats, now you have
1 boat.
1 boat. And when that 1 boat is the only one that shows up down here in South Carolina, that's where you see Calhoun's smile turn into this frown that he has in your picture. Why was Calhoun upset? It's because his state and the farmers were making a lot of money, but now this tariff gets passed and now they are not. So tariff comes to the Congress, Calhoun comes to the Congress, he basically says, this tariff has got to go, and you start, and not only does he say that, he says, not only does this tariff have to go, if it doesn't go, South Carolina is leaving this country. We're going to break away and make our own country where we don't have tariffs.
So Calhoun wanted to leave the Union not because Marty McFly lost the flux capacitor, but because they were losing out on European business.
Exactly. Correct.
All this time I thought it was because of the flux capacitor.
Doc. Back to the Future.
Doc Brown. Anyone back to the
I know,
future?
yeah.
Okay.
1, 2, and 3.
All right. So things are looking tense. Andrew Jackson basically says, hey, you try and leave Calhoun, I'm commander-in-chief. I'm going to send the U.S. Army. So it looks like they're getting ready to
Fight
again. Things are getting tense, and guess who steps in? Henry Clay.
Oh man,
The great compromiser.
The beast.
The beast. Or the peacemaker.
The beast.
The beast peacemaker.
Beast peacemaker.
from the east.
From the east.
Beast peacemaker from the east.
The beast peacemaker from the east. Say that.
Beast peacemaker from the east. 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 Beast peacemaker from the east.
Dang, look at your lingual soldiers. That is impressive.
Yeah.
So, Henry Clay steps in. He's like, hey, you guys, relax. I got this. Well, how he talks. How do you think he would talk?
That's how he talked. Hey guys, I got this. That kind of thing.
Hey guys, I got this.
I picture more as like Forrest Gump, maybe.
Trying to
Congress, I got this. I love Congress.
My name's Forrest Gump. People call me Forrest Gump.
Now it's Henry Clay. My friends call me Clay.
So, what does Clay do? How does he mellow things out and calm everybody's nerves? Here's what
Another
he does.
compromise? Does he do another compromise?
Another compromise. So this time, his idea to cool everybody out is he basically says, Andrew Jackson, hey, you got a war on your hands. Here's my idea. Why don't we get rid of this tariff? Andrew Jackson's like, not happening. It's like, how about we give it a time period, maybe like 6 years. And that's where it says, worked out by Clay, limits time period of the tariff. He basically says, we got to get rid of this, otherwise the South is leaving, you got to fight your hands. So let's just put a number on it. You can have this tariff for another 8 years, 6 years. Then he goes to Calhoun. He's like, Calhoun, I'm going to get rid of this tariff, you just got to wait a little bit. I know you guys both have to give something up, but why don't we try and compromise to work out the deal? And that's exactly what ends up happening. Things cool out, crisis averted. Who does it? Who helps work out the deal?
Henry Clay.
Henry Clay, and that's how he gets the nickname the Great Compromiser, right? Does that make sense? Crisis averted again. It's a little complicated though with all the numbers, right? It's not the easiest concept in the world. All right, so this happens 1832. Everything is pretty calm for kind of a chunk of time, almost like 18 years, until the year 1850. Now, some pretty significant stuff happens in that 18-year period. Primarily the United States, well, we know that that territory that was right next to the South and the West belonged to Spain. Mexico has a revolution, becomes independent, and we know that Mexico has a big chunk of territory. The United States, we know from westward expansion, goes to war with Mexico, gains all this land, right? And here's what happens next. Compromise 1850. What happens here is that California wants to come in as free, right? And if you're a person living in the South, you're a Southern senator, you're like, no way, Jose, this is not happening. If California comes in, that's going to be into our Southern territory, so we're not having it. So they're angry. The Northerners are like, yeah, that works for us. We're going to get California, so they're all happy with it. Either way, you have another conflict. It's over a very similar issue with what happened with Missouri. So they look like they're going to fight, and guess who comes in to save the day?
Henry Clay.
Henry Clay. This will be his final compromise. Spoiler alert, he doesn't make it past too much longer past this one. So here's what he has for his idea for yet another compromise. He says California will come in free, but he proposes what becomes known as the Fugitive Slave Act. And what this does is it basically says if there is a slave in the South that tries to escape to the North, it will be a felony offense if you're a Northerner and you let them stay with you. So picture you being a guy living in Chicago and you see a slave that has run away and he comes to your house. He's like, hey, I'm in big trouble. Can you help me out? And you're like, hey, man, you gotta come in. Like, you're a slave. That was crazy.
That was crazy. Yeah.
Before this, you could have let that guy come in your house and maybe taken care of him and not even really had a
No
worry about
repercussions,
Yeah.
no consequences. Now you're violating federal law.
He's like, no, guys.
punishable
Potential
by
jail.
jail.
Yeah, jail time.
Yeah.
After this Fugitive Slave Act. So once Clay proposes this, if you're that Northerner, you're like, whoa, I can't like picture that happening. A guy knocking on your door. You're like, hey man, I'm not gonna go to jail. Sorry,
So
that's
yeah,
like
you say-
that's like 5 years prison. Go to the next place. Sorry. You'd have to be like pretty brave to be able to be like, all right, come in. You'd have to risk a lot, right?
Right.
So Southerners like this because a lot of their slaves are escaping. So when the Southerner hears about the Fugitive Slave Act part of Clay's compromise, they're like, yes, now you're talking our language. We'll agree to that. Now we'll think about letting California come in. You're doing a law that's going to get our slaves back? We want to do that. And the other, so they kind of buy in. And the last thing that kind of seals the deal for the South is this area right here known as the Utah Territory and this area known as the New Mexico Territory. They come up with this thing called popular sovereignty, which was basically
Self-rule.
Self-rule. Let the state decide if they want slavery or not. So popular sovereignty is where you let the states decide.
Have you guys ever heard the word sovereignty before? Yeah. It's power. Like the sovereign ruler of a nation.
So this works. They agree to the compromise. Henry Clay dies 2 years later.
Bummer.
The great compromiser is dead.
So next time there's a problem, who's going to save the day?
Ghostbusters.
Yeah, if we're lucky.
So things are solved for now. I heard somewhere I read on Henry Clay's gravestone, he said, I knew no north, I knew no south, I knew no west. I only knew the United States of America. He goes down as being like this unifier, not a divider.
Unifier.
Peacemaker from the east.
It doesn't take long before after he dies before stuff starts going south. Okay, here's what happens next. Everybody flip over the back. Do you see where it says Kansas-Nebraska Act?
Yes.
Well, there's this guy that comes in, going to the next slide. There's a picture of him. I don't have a picture on your notes, but his name is Stephen A. Douglas. He comes up with this idea of, hey, we really like this idea of popular sovereignty. You let Utah and New Mexico do that, so I have an idea. Why don't we let the Nebraska and Kansas territories do that same thing? And right away, Northerners are like, no way. Under the Missouri Compromise,
anything above 3630.
Above that 3630 line, you said that you would never let this area go slave. And if the people in Nebraska or Kansas vote, then they could technically vote and make it slave. That would break the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay's only been dead 2 years, and you already want to like break the compromise he worked out? And the Southerners are like, uh-huh.
Yep.
And this guy, Stephen Douglas, is like, that's exactly what we want to do. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act basically says, let's let Kansas and Nebraska have popular sovereignty and break the Missouri Compromise. So Kansas-Nebraska Act basically lets Kansas, and it works, it gets passed. And it leads to tension between the North and the South.
Huge amounts of conflict within those states, though.
So Kansas-Nebraska Act, they now get to vote in the state if they want slavery or not. So Kansas/Nebraska lets them vote on slavery. And directly breaks the Missouri Compromise. So picture Henry Clay like rolling his grave, like, I did all that work and you're getting rid of the work I did? And this leads to a pretty big problem. See Kansas right here? Once this happens and Kansas and Nebraska get to vote if they want slavery or not, all these Southerners start pouring into Kansas and saying that they live there so they can vote to have slavery. And once they start doing that, then where'd it go? I have another slide for this. Once they start doing that, the Northerners flood into Kansas. And they're like, hey, you can't come and do that. We're going to do the same thing. So now you have Southerners flowing into Kansas, and you have Northerners flowing into Kansas. And they start getting these arguments on the street. And this is kind of like what the scene could have looked like in this picture. And they start literally like picture you go into a Kansas town, like walking around the street of Topeka being like, can't believe these Southerners. And then you're walking by a group of guys that are like, can't believe these Northerners. And then they're like, what'd you say?
And there's no Henry
Yeah,
Clay in the middle to go, hey, we're all American.
Yeah. He's just like, I'm going to kill you.
Bam!
He just killed my friend.
You dead. I shot him dead.
I'm going to shoot you dead. I just got shot in my stomach. Unbelievable. I think I'm going to die.
You gon' die. You done already dead.
they start literally fighting. Like, it is no longer peaceful, it is turning bloody, and this becomes known as Bleeding Kansas.
So what's the cause of Bleeding Kansas? The massive influx of Southerners and Northerners into this undivided territory.
Yeah, Kansas, Nebraska.
Yeah, you could say that.
Starts there, east side.
Yeah.
So, our compromises and it getting worked out is starting to break down, right? And here's what you have here. Dred Scott was basically like a slave. He was owned by a person in the South, a white guy in the South, basically, that owned him. This white guy in the South he was a doctor, and he would he would go up to the north and spend like summers there. So picture the white owner and his slave Dred Scott, and being like, Dred, we're going up to the north. Get your stuff. And be like, I don't want to go. He's like, you're my slave, you have to, let's go. And then they go up to the north, right? When they get back down to the south, Dred Scott basically takes the case to court, and here's his argument. He says, hey, I was in the north, and there's no slavery in the north, so shouldn't I be free to... Oh, I forgot an important detail. His owner dies.
Yeah.
So he's kind of like up for grabs. He's like, hey, my owner died, I was in the north, shouldn't I be free? And this case goes all the way to the Supreme Court, where this guy, oh man, Tanny, look at these characters.
Tawny.
Tawny, or yeah, how do you say it? Is it Tawny?
Most of the time it's Tawny. You can tell he talks to that, right? Like, Dred Scott was an abomination.
So Tanny is the Supreme Court justice, and he's able to convince the other judges to do this move. So Scott spent 2 years in a free state, sued for freedom. So the Supreme Court under Taney declares all Africans in both free and slave states as pieces of property. And he compares them to no different than if you had a dog, or like technically you buy and sell a dog, it's your property, right?
And this goes against his personal ideology because he was a slaveholder himself, but he was known to treat his slaves very well, and he even gave them pensions after they retired and stuff. So this was an interesting character in history right here. Kind of a contradiction in the other way. We talk about Jefferson being a hypocrite and the fact that all men are created equal, yet he held slaves. Here's a guy who basically says all slaves are property, but he treated his slaves with dignity and respect. Kind of weird.
Yeah, like they have a job.
Yeah, kind of weird.
So he basically says, Dred Scott, you cannot bring court cases because you're not a citizen of the United States. You're the same as a piece of property. Yeah, like you're the same as a pencil. You're the same as a dog. You're someone's property. You're not like a human being.
Just like a car.
See?
Yeah, exactly. So he's like, what do you mean? And he's like, it'd be like if a dog walked in and was like knocked on the door. It's like, I have a court case. They'd be like, get out of here, dog. You're a dog. You're not a human being. You're not a citizen. You can't bring a court
Even
case.
if the dog is justified and has great legal defense.
It's like, Russ,
I just want to hear Russo bark some more. Sorry.
A dog just want a bunch more playing poker.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So this happens. Taney argues that African Americans are not U.S. citizens and have no right to bring the court case. So this infuriates Northerners because there were a lot of free blacks or Africans living in the North. And this is a huge setback for them, and this just leads to the tension. All right, so that did not help the situation. Things start getting really tense. There were Africans living in the North and the South, and there is a huge movement that starts known as abolitionists, which is the movement for people who wanted to free all slaves.
A lot of them were white. It's important to notice that, a lot of abolitionists like John Brown were white people. We tend to think that, only like whenever you think of blacks gaining equal rights in our country, you think of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, you think of all these, but we forget about John Brown and a lot of the abolitionists that made even the initial steps possible prior to Civil War. An abolitionist is what? If I'm an abolitionist, what do I believe?
Slaves.
Yeah, somebody who wants to free all slaves.
So that pushes a lot more people in the North than that home.
Yep.
And even in the South too, a lot of people living in the South are like, hey, I know there's slaves everywhere, but this kind of seems messed up. Even Jefferson himself, this is like, you've got the wolf by the ears, like, we're in a
Let 'em
tough
go.
spot here.
We're gonna get bit.
So,
Sometimes we're gonna get out.
one of the white sympathizers who became an abolitionist was this woman known as Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? Harriet, wasn't that her first name?
Harriet Beecher Stowe.
There she is.
Uncle Tom's Cabin.
She puts out a book called Uncle's Tom Cabin. Now, haven't you guys read it? Do you think you'll read it? I'm going to tell you what happens at the end. I don't want to do a spoiler.
Spoiler alert. Spoiler
I
alert.
don't think
The whole story, she does a really good job in the novel. It's like nonfiction, right?
Yeah,
Or not nonfiction, I'm sorry, it's fiction.
It's
It's based
fiction.
on
but it's
an imaginary
It's
person.
based on it's supposed to be real, but it's fictional characters.
So she builds up in this story she builds in this story this idea of there being a slave and his owner, and she really kind of portrays the slave as like a human being. Like when you're reading the book, you start feeling like the slave in the book is like your friend, somebody you know. And his owner is this really mean guy, and you can kind of see on the cover, he gets beat and treated really unfairly, and he dies. That's a spoiler alert. In the end of the book. So have you ever been reading a book the whole time, you're like, oh, I hope everything works out, and then it works out, and you're like, oh, that was a really good book. Or you read it, and you're like, he died, I can't believe it. That's a really good book.
But if you're like almost there, then someone just tells you.
Yeah, or somebody
That's
ruins it
not
for
good
you.
advice.
Yes. That's what a lot of people did. So a lot of people in North and South read this book, and they get done. And you have a lot of people that thought slavery was okay, and they read this book, and they're like, this is wrong.
We should not do
Slavery is wrong. He died. Oh my God. Right?
I go with my friend.
So this convinces a lot of people, this book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, convinces a lot of people to become abolitionists, right? Including this gentleman,
John Brown.
John Brown. John Brown was another white guy who lived in the North, and he doesn't even want to like peacefully get rid of slavery now. He believes in it so passionately that he convinces his kids and his family to go to this place called Harper's Ferry, which was where federal arms were being stored. He wants to break in, get guns, and really like go around and kill or lead a rebellion to free slaves. So he is a white guy who is willing to risk prison or death to free slaves.
Okay.
And it doesn't work out so well for him. He convinces his son to go raid Harper's Ferry. See where it says Harper's Ferry? That's where the guns were. They get the guns, they get arrested, and they're sentenced to death for treason?
Yeah, treason.
For treason. And this picture right here is a painting that was done that shows him technically on his way to be hanged. And he is. He and his son are hanged for their crime. So he dies trying to free slaves. And that's a famous painting. An African-American woman is holding up her child, and he's giving a little baby kiss right before he gets hanged. Like, she's like, thank you for everything you did.
So
And he
John
goes.
Brown is an abolitionist whose son gets killed.
And
Now he's even more infuriated.
and he gets killed too. Right?
But that's what I meant to say. I guess now people are more
Oh,
infuriated.
yes, yeah.
That's what I meant to say.
People hear about this and they're like getting angry. So things are getting more and more tense.
More heated. It's getting heated in here.
Now, see this strapping young fellow here? Born and raised in the rugged forests of Kentucky?
I look like Abe Lincoln.
That looks like Abe Lincoln. You guys, when you have a $5 bill in your pocket, you're probably used to seeing Abe Lincoln with a beard. Well, this is him when he was a little bit younger. He wants to be the senator of Illinois.
He does. He does.
And he goes on a tour in 1858 or 18.
That's about right.
Yeah, like 1858. He
Late
and this
50s.
guy, Stephen Douglas, same one that comes up with that idea of popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska, they go on a tour of the country and they do debates, just like Obama and Romney just got done doing debates. They kind of do the same thing. Douglas argues about why popular sovereignty is good, and Lincoln argues about why he thinks that maybe that's not a good idea. The election in Illinois happens, and guess who wins?
Lincoln.
He does not.
What?
He loses
I mean,
the
the other
election.
guy.
Douglas wins and becomes a senator for Illinois. And Lincoln's like, I'm lost. But if you know anything about Lincoln, you know he doesn't give up easily. So a little bit of time goes by, and guess what he does in 1860? He runs for president, and he wins.
Yep, all right.
Greg, did we skip the Underground Railroad?
No, we totally skipped
Do
Underground
you guys
Railroad.
have the Underground Railroad? All right, quickly. Remember when we talked about the Fugitive Slave Act and how Rousseau explained how people in the North would turn slaves away? Well, there were some people who would allow them to do it, and they had a chain of command that was basically it was called the Underground Railroad. Don't envision the whole choo-choo, no train, none of that stuff. But it was an underground network connection that allowed slaves from the South to escape to the North to become free.
And that's what that map is. If you see the map, it shows the routes that they would take to get out, to get to Canada, Mexico, Cuba, basically get us out of the United States.
Yeah.
Get us to freedom.
And if you think about a conductor on a
Like
train,
when they're trying to get out.
Yeah.
Never wants to come in.
Yes.
thinking about a conductor of a train, Harriet Tubman is your person. So whenever you think of the Underground Railroad, think of Harriet Tubman.
And she knew of all the good spots to stay. So if you say you escaped here and this far in the South, she would know like spots to stay in this city, this city,
Routes
this
to
city, this
take.
city. So you come in the night, you knock on the back door, you go 1, 2, 3, and they'd open up. Like, come on. And they
Very
say,
sophisticated.
A lot of it happened at night. It was pretty intense. Okay.
So with Clay dead, with all the animosity that was created from John Brown's death, the election of 1860 when Lincoln wins, there's no compromise coming up. The time for compromise is over. The South sees that they have no viable option. Like, going back to the hook that Mr. Russo talked about, is there a time where you just tried and diplomacy failed? You had to go to fisticuffs. The election of 1860 was it.
That sends the South overboard. And it starts with South Carolina.
They're the
South
first to
Carolina's like, see you guys, we're going to make our own country down here. We don't need to fight, but we're not going to be a part of the United States. We're going to make our own country. We're going to make our own constitution, and we're going to call it, see your last note, the Confederate States of America. That's what everybody. We're going to call ourselves the Confederate States of America. No need to fight. We're just going to do our own thing down here. Starts with South Carolina. By the end, you can see on here, a lot more states follow. And that's basically your whole South. This whole area that used to be the United States now becomes the Confederate States. It's no longer technically the United States. They elect their own president,
Jefferson
Davis. And Lincoln's next move is like, no, you guys
No,
aren't.
you don't.
And this is the beginning of the Civil War, which is the next year. All right, so that's it. And then there's your new flag of the new country. And there it is. Flip stops. It'll basically be like, is that this like drift? Then he's gonna come back and go. We'll be like, wow.
By the way,
We could just. that was
somebody
cool.
give him a monster
Yes.
shots.
I
Is
know,
that a
I
monster?
don't drink those things anymore.
Good for you.
That's good.
Yeah, that's good. It's one less heart attack. You don't have.
Yeah.
Okay, so here we go.
Okay.
Please don't touch me.
So with Mr.
So we're gonna cut this part out too.
I'm gonna cut this part out. I'll get cut.
You whiffed, cunt.
I know.
Swing and a miss. Right to it.
Okay. I might not be able to pull back. You ever done a video with me where I told this on Yeah.
So let's tell a horrible joke.
Oh man. I asked Mr. Lindbergh, or Mr. Lineberg, I'm sorry. We did a video once and I was like,
Couldn't get you back.
couldn't give me back. Let's hope that doesn't